Hello and welcome to Newsnight. I am Ladi Akeredoluale. Thanks for joining us today. The war situation created by Russia's invasion of Ukraine is still grabbing international headlines and creating repercussions both foreseen and unforeseen. My guest says the world order is negatively affected when big countries can lord it over smaller ones, and that this is not limited to the current situation. My guest also believes that the United Nations has had its challenges in keeping its member countries within the bounds of respect for dialogue and peaceful resolutions of disagreements. Newsnight talks to Nigeria's former ambassador to Switzerland and permanent representative to the United Nations in Geneva, Ambassador Joseph Anyalogu. Your Excellency, thank you for your time. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I want us to start from the genesis, if you like, the background of this Russia-Ukraine crisis, because for many people, it started for them when they saw that Russia was massing troops on the Ukrainian border shortly before the invasion, and then the invasion took place. But could you give us the background from your own perspective of what led to this situation, both from a Russian perspective and from a Ukrainian perspective?
Well, thank you. Well, to begin with, we have to at least try to look at what the combatants say, especially what the attacking country say as his reason for this attack. Russia's position has been that they weren't expecting not Ukraine to join NATO, but Ukraine recently has been applying to join NATO and the European Union, and that they believe that their own what they call the strategic security interest of Russia is impugned by Ukraine joining NATO, and when Ukraine refuses, says that it is averse that it is the sovereign nation that can choose the way it goes, Russia, especially Putin, seem not to be able to accept that, hence this attack. We don't know the objective. Is it to bring Ukraine back into what you might call is the Russian sphere of interest by force, or to teach Ukraine a lesson, or to deter Ukraine from pursuing a Western-oriented policy, both diplomatic, security, and economic, and everything. So that is, I'm just trying to put it in a short way. It's generally an issue of Putin insisting that Russia must be part of its own sphere of interest and does not want it to go westward any further. It made a point much earlier in 2014 when Russia annexed Ukraine, ostensibly on the grounds that it was protecting the Russians that were in that region, the Russian, ethnic Russians that are in that region. But actually, that was the first step, the first salvo, I would say, in this fight when Russia suddenly, out of a decision that it has to control Ukraine and where Ukraine moves, interferes or annexes a part of another sovereign country, thereby undermining the main plank of the relationship among countries, among nations, at least in the 21st century or 20th, 21st century. That is respect for sovereignty, state sovereignty, and territorial integrity. So, in a nutshell, it's a way. The war started with Ukraine deciding to Russia deciding to get Ukraine to do exactly what.
Let me then say, let me ask you this then. Do you think that the Russians have a point? What is so special about Ukraine? Because the Russians were there when Latvia, when Estonia, and a couple of other countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union joined NATO. Some of them joined the EU, and Russia didn't really raise too much of an eyebrow. But in the case of Ukraine, as you pointed out, Russia has been insistent that the Ukrainian case is different. You served as a diplomat in Ukraine not too long ago. And when I say not too long ago, I mean something like 20, 25 years ago. What is so special about Ukraine, the Ukraine, that Russia has to go all out, which it didn't in the case of some of the other countries?
Well, let's be fair on Russia a bit. It has been complaining about what it calls NATO move westwards. Sorry, NATO move eastwards. It has been complaining, but not necessarily taking any drastic action. That was why you saw Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, Hungary, most of which were under the Russian influence under the Soviet USSR regime period. But one might say that it has the annoyance, let's put it like that, has come to a head in Ukraine, and they thought, and Putin thought that that is it, that this was the time to act. With regard to why should they even do that with Ukraine? Well, there's been a lot of, there is a closer affinity between Ukraine and Russia in terms of, well, the same Slavic, Eastern Slavic ethnic grouping, the same, they were all part of the Kievan Rus. They were also part of the Russia under the Tsarist regimes and so on. That's what Putin sees Russia really. Putin sees Ukraine as a Russian sphere of influence. Now, when you are now talking of the concept of power blocks, spheres of interest, which define the international relations in the past centuries up to even the middle of the 20th century, it was those concepts of spheres of interest that led to the First World War and the Second World War. So for those reasons, Putin, rightly or wrongly, feels it still has a hold. It must have a hold. Russia must have a hold on Ukraine. And a few other former members of the USSR, but I think they are a lot more sensitive about Ukraine. And now that concept, that attitude is running against what you have in Ukraine now as a feeling, a nationalist feeling that they need to be free, that they want to define what they do, who they relate with. They don't see that they are in any way antipathetic to Russia, that they would do anything ever to undermine Russia's interest. I think that was part of the gesture they made when 1994 they handed over all the nuclear arsenals that were domain in Ukraine. At least to give a sense of assurance, but somehow Putin argues that he's not reassured, that part of what they call Russian security system includes a must include Ukraine that is well, let me say let me not say subservient, but under the control of Russia. So that is the situation.
There are those who have identified that the internal politics of both countries have been brought to bear as well, and that has also played a major role in what has now happened. In the case of Russia, there is increasing nationalism, as exemplified previously, before now, by the annexation of Crimea, and in the case of Ukraine, by the progressive election of leaders that did not necessarily tie themselves to the apron strings of the Russians, which made them nervous, especially after the revolution of 2014, which led to the exit of the then pro-Russian president in Ukraine. Is this a correct analysis of the situation?
Well, I would say in a way, and it's understandable, with Russia's attitude and viewpoint about uh, uh, happenings in Ukraine, the way it is that it must be pro-Russia. They had proceeded to impact in so many ways in the internal politics of Ukraine, which is why they tend to have been supporting so-called breakaway, uh, so-called breakaway or dissident Russian groups, especially in the Donbass area, the Donbass region, who, of course, make it their policy, their attitude to undermine where the majority of Ukrainians want to go, that is go west. So you now have a splintering Soviet people, pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian and or say pro-West. So that is the how the internal politics have become polarized because of the pressure coming from Russia.
Now, let's come to what some have described as the meddlesome interlopers in this crisis, and that is those who are not even within the region, but they are playing major roles, or they have played major roles in some views, in creating the problem here. Perhaps you could enlighten us on what the United States' strategic interest is in this Russia-Ukraine crisis, beyond what some have described as poking Russia in the eye. What do they have a strategic interest in the Ukraine, and ensuring that Ukraine falls within their ambit?
Well, arising from the developments after the end of the the end of Second World War, leading up to the breakdown of breakup of the Soviet Union. There have been the bipolar world. You had the Warsaw Pact, the NATO, of course. Under the NATO, you have America, the Western allies. When the when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was not just a splintering of countries, but a breakdown of the Warsaw Pact that was largely members of the former Soviet Union. You would say that the the U.S. looks at from the concept of the unipolar arrangement, where it is the dominant power, or appears to be the dominant power after the fall of the Soviet Union, that it has a responsibility to defend the interest of its Western allies in Europe and call the Western world. So that is their strategic interest, and it could lead to other embedded into it will be economic and interest, value systems, democracy, freedom of speech, liberalization, and all that. So you have those concepts embedded as part of what you would call the strategic interest of Russia, of the United States. So for them, they see uh, uh, Europe as part of their spheres of interest. So because of the various alliances they have with especially the European Union. But you see, it's possible that if American policy could have been a lot more circumspect, they would probably have been more concerned about trying to not to make their former fallen foe, let's put it that way, the Soviet Union, continue to lose too much face. That is, that make them feel that they were no longer well, that powerful. So the element of being poked in the eye comes in, and there have been so many putting up that argument. But of course, at the end of the day, it will not necessarily justify the action that the Russian government is taking in Ukraine at the moment.
Of course, everybody knows from watching wildlife documentaries that when you poke a bear, the reaction is unpredictable. And in this particular instance, what the Russians have done probably went beyond what was being expected, which brings me to NATO itself. What value, in your view, does Ukraine have for NATO? Why would NATO be willing to, as it were, goad this crisis into creating a situation where Russia felt it had no option but to make a stand or to draw a line in the sand over Ukraine? Ukraine is not known to be one of the strategic advantages in Europe that NATO could take advantage of.
Well, given that Ukraine itself didn't stand to hurt the Russia's security per se. But the more it went sought alliance or participation or membership of NATO and EU, the more that Russia that feels that it should be under its sphere of interest should was that Russia would be gradually, it was offending definitely the sensitivities of Russia. If we must admit that. Some people have argued that perhaps Ukraine should have had been a bit more slow at rushing into the NATO or even EU, or even if they go to the EU, but perhaps not the NATO. Those are some countries on the that's not too far from the Russian Russian boundaries, like Sweden. Sweden is a member of the EU, but not necessarily NATO. So it's eventually boils down to a matter of choice. What the Ukrainians felt was their interest, and that I think the feeling that in Ukraine is that they have a right to choose where they belong, where they want to go, and it's rubbing off against Russia. That's the point.
The critics of this present situation say that the EU, NATO, the United States, they all goaded Ukraine into facing Russia. And that now that Russia has reacted, they are all sending aid, but nobody has boots on ground to support the Ukraine in this crisis situation, in this war situation. Is that a fair reflection of what is really happening?
Well, they not entirely that fair. To begin with, the concept that Europe and the US and so on were goading, that is deliberately instigating to instigating Ukraine to to be able to flex its muscles or define its freedom. I wouldn't say that strategic and deliberate approach. It's just that being very close to countries that are in the West, enjoying democracy, enjoying quite a number of things that the democracy, free spirit, Catholicism gives you. That it's not unusual that will rub off on trade. Just as it has happened with the other countries, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, Hungary. There's definitely a change when these countries were under the Soviet or communistic influence begin to make contact with the West. It happens. So we must admit that it's not necessarily a deliberate policy, but because it's happened, there is an expectation that Russia should react to Ukraine the way it has reacted to the other, in the case of the other countries that have gone west, and that's take it that is part of natural development. But I think that at the end of the day, Russian leaders may actually be worrying about the influence of having countries that used to be under the core influence, communist style values and interests, very close to them. And in this case, people who were ethnically Russian or have affinity to with the very close steps of ethnicity and all that. That suddenly they're showing off the influence of being in the West. That would also reflect on what happens inside Russia itself. Might even generate an approach, an attitude that might not be in line with what they want to happen in Russia. So that could be a concern.
This situation for someone like you, who was Nigeria's permanent representative at the United Nations in Geneva. You were a permanent delegate to the United Nations Disarmament Conference, and then, of course, you served in the Ukraine, amongst other places. This situation, some have in fact pointed out, highlights the seeming impotence of the international communities, bodies, the agencies or organizations like the United Nations, because all what has happened has taken place outside the United Nations. The sanctions that have been imposed, the counter measures put in place by Russia, the announcement of a nuclear deterrent and all that has taken place outside of the United Nations, which is where conflicts such as this were supposed to have been resolved in the first place.
Well, yes, I agree to the point, observation that the UN has quite a lot of limitations. Anyway, let's go back to the UN. The UN was set up as an effort to use multilateralism in dealing with global challenges, the kind of challenges that have led to two major civil wars. I mean, two major world wars in a century. So it works by way of multilateral understanding, agreement, and so on. It doesn't have that force to prevent any infracting country or punishing any country that doesn't go its way. We normally say that the UN doesn't really have an army except for when it wants to go for peacekeeping. And the way it's structured, again, you have the Security Council that most of the powers, either the old powers or some of the new powers, they have the veto power, so they can veto whatever they do, which is why it was difficult to chastise the U.S. when it also went wrong in quite a number of either Iraq or Libya and so on. And that is also why it is almost becoming difficult for the UN to call Russia to order, beside the various speeches we have had against Russian aggression and, of course, regional actions like the one the sanctions the EU is putting together, or the NATO or the other Western countries put together, just to well, chastise or stop Russia, hopefully in its tracks. So, in essence, the UN has a clear fit at some major challenges, and we do not see any solution, any way to change that scenario now, at any time in.
Which means that in the coming days, months, and possibly years, the countries that are called hegemons, the US is one, Russia is one, and then China is one, can reasonably be expected to act more this way. You have pointed out that in the past, the United States ignored the United Nations when it didn't get its way within the Council to go into Iraq, to go into Afghanistan, and now Russia has gone into Ukraine without any reference to the United Nations. China has always threatened that it will reunite with Taiwan by force if necessary. So again, it does appear as if this kind of situation that we have in Russia or with Russia and Ukraine seems more like the chances of it reoccurring, even if Russia and Ukraine were resolved, are still quite high.
Well, yeah, you're right. Well, but let's be hopeful that multilateral diplomacy also has its triumphs, and that by at least setting out certain values as a modus operandi, one of which is that all states are equal. You must respect the territoriality of states. You must respect the sovereignty of states. That is the ground norm. And any deviation will not be tolerated. At least the world body and the various states, the global society should be able to accept it, and it's already accepted. When there are cases of this infraction, this is of course when there will be pressure on the infracting entity, state, the hegemon, to know that it's not right, that this is not the way to go. But to predict, it's possible that we would have more hegemons having their way. This is why it has been so difficult to get certain states. There are certain states who argue that because you cannot control the big powers, especially over nuclear, that they want to have their own nuclear capacity. A country like North Korea, Iran, and so on. So these are one of the challenges in our days, achieving what is seen as the best option for humanity, that is a nuclear-free world, or at least a world that is either nuclear-free or very well controlled nuclear situation. So that's quite a challenge.
I'm happy you mentioned the nuclear thing, because one of the things that Russia has done is that in the immediate aftermath of the attack on the Ukraine, when it appeared as if there might be some outside intervention, it put its nuclear deterrent on high alert. And even though there were immediate reactions to say that didn't matter, uh, it does matter, doesn't it? I mean, when we're talking about nuclear weapons, as you've just spoken about, this is not child's play, and this is not something to be toyed with.
Well, it's quite sad. It's quite worrying that Putin made that comment. Uh, it was, we would say, it's almost too quite heavy. It's quite loaded. You would want to ignore it, but you can't ignore it because, again, the Russian political arrangement is where there is one dominant person and who can decide to deploy whatever weaponry. It doesn't need to go through, well, it goes through the Duma. It makes reference to Duma, but the Duma cannot even, would always do what he tells them to do. At least that is what the facts on the ground. So it's quite, that comment is sending some ruffles around, even though I was listening to President Biden. He says that it hasn't got to the point that for them to worry. But of course, certain analysts say that it shouldn't be taken for granted. Worry because it should worry because Putin has taken some actions that people normally did not expect to happen to take that he would take. For instance, this rolling into Ukraine, and even back to the time he annexed Crimea. So that it is not, cannot be ruled out that he would use some nuclear, even if it's a low-level nuclear as a weaponry. But the point that whatever he uses that is nuclear will generate far-reaching consequences. So let's hope that it was just talk.
Let me bring you, because again, all that this highlights is the fact that when two quote and unquote elephants fight, the grass ends up suffering. And part of what we have seen in the last couple of days is images and pictures of innocent civilians, including Nigerians who got trapped in Ukraine, who got trapped in the middle. And then there was, what that highlighted was Nigeria's relations, in the case of the Nigerian students and Nigerian citizens, Nigeria's relations with the countries in that region who could have been on assistance to such people in such circumstances, the likes of Poland, the likes of Hungary, and so on, which could have offered, which were in position to offer some level of succor, assuming that the people could get to the border. And then it also highlighted Nigeria's relations. We had the foreign affairs minister saying, look, we have good relations with Russia. We have good relations with the Ukraine, even though we condemned the invasion, but we're still supporting the diplomatic route. That's what a diplomat should do, and that's probably what you would do. But in terms of real politique on the ground, foreign policy politique, when you have your citizens in harm's way, is this really helpful?
Well, it could be helpful, especially if you consider that your citizens are in harm's way. You do not want to say or do things that will put them more in harm's way. So we would apply diplomacy. It makes sense. Now, I think you're raising two issues now. One is the situation of Nigeria there.
Yes.
Am I right?
Yes.
Well, let me say that the aggression must have taken a lot of people by surprise. But when you look at it again, there were signs. At least the U.S. were saying that there was, have been telling us for the past 2 or 3 weeks before that Putin is preparing to strike and will strike, even though Putin will say no, he was just doing army maneuvers and testing, but eventually it turns out that he knew what he was doing. I do not know whether our embassy prepared for evacuation. But you know, evacuating Nigerians that number over 5,000, well, it will be a tall order. But again, there could have been preparation because, well, my observation and assessment and knowledge of the area, it's a vast country. Nigerians live scattered all over. Some are closer to certain borders. If they were thinking of an eruption of this nature, maybe people who wanted to leave or who feel the need to leave would have started leaving much earlier, especially following the US and UK travel orders that were made quite popular. So as it stands now, the best that can be done, you can't leave to anybody because the airspace is closed and unsafe. So movement will invariably have to be by road or by rail, moving towards friendly borders. Well, lucky enough, most of the borders are bordered by friendly countries. So if you manage to get there, depending on where you are, if you are Kyiv, you can up to Western Ukraine, you can go towards Lvov, some can go through Hungary, there's Slovakia, there's Romania, there's Moldova. So essentially, these are the options that Nigerians in flight would use. But at least the foreign minister has made some moves to negotiate with those countries to allow easy passage of Nigeria. So that's done. Unfortunately, the reality on the ground is that the Nigerians out there who have not left are largely on their own. But let me point out again, even given the scenario, I know that the Nigerians in diaspora have been working hard to support the efforts of Nigerian community, Nigerians within Ukraine, because I know that you have branches of the Nigerian community in Nigerians in diaspora or Nigerian community in Europe, in various towns in Ukraine itself. They have Kharkov. You know, it's a standard procedure. They gather together and set themselves and meet and arrange their socials, but now it's gone beyond socials because they have to help each other. So they've done quite a lot, and we'll commend them for that. Now, the second part of your question, I think you were wondering whether Nigeria,
whether we had the foreign policy towards these friendly countries that you mentioned, the likes of Hungary, because prior to this crisis, many Nigerians had never heard of the Ukraine. Possibly outside of diplomats like yourself, most Nigerians, most people resident in Nigeria had never heard of the Ukraine.
Well, not really. Nigerians, people who have traveled, they know about Ukraine. In fact, a lot of the professional that built at Jokuta came from Ukraine, even though it was arranged under the Soviet Union. So they know, well, the people who need to know, they know, or who want to know. But the issue is, like, let's go back to what you said about having two friends, friendly countries fighting over that we who are watching, our government will be wondering, we'll be considering what line of action to take, or what, even to the point of what to say. I would, of course, understand that this requires careful diplomatic footing. We do not want to offend the Russians. We are sympathetic with the Ukrainians that are losing life, property, and everything. We also want to make them feel comfortable. But at the end of the day, if you have two brothers or two friends fighting, you must, at a point, be able to tell we assess who is wrong. And then the least you can do is to tell that person who is wrong that this particular action you are taking is wrong, even though you are friends. I would think that at the end of the day, Nigeria, even the African countries, I'm hoping to hear something from AU about this matter. I think South Africa has said something, but Africa needs to has a strong ties with the Soviet Union and also with Ukraine. That needs to say we need to be able to say tells the big power that is pouncing on the smaller country on we will say unprovoked that line of action is not acceptable because it undermines the basis for which all the states now exist. Because in the world, the global environment, you have big states, small states, very small states. And if we accept that the big states will want to gobble up the smaller states, smaller states, because they are not abiding by what the states want, then the whole system will collapse and anybody could be affected. I think that Nigeria has even at this point set an example. There was a time we were arguing about Bakassi. We went to the World Court. We lost Bakassi. There was a lot of there were quite a lot of things we lost, oil and all that. But we didn't take a possible option of going to use our force or power to knock down Cameroon. So, but we accepted that. So what I'm saying is that in spite of whatever Russia thinks it's a personal affront or offense, it could always be managed by diplomacy, agreed upon, arranged. And if they were also to be more tolerant of the opinion of the literal states, well, states that border them. Russia is a big country, the biggest country in the world, almost about 13.7 square kilometers, and the eastern boundaries extend to the United States, because the U.S., Russia actually has a boundary with the U.S., just separated by the Bering Strait. Then you have
yes,
Alaska.
that's right.
So you at times you wonder why are they worried about proximity to NATO states, whereas they're very proximal to have the biggest NATO country. So at the end of the day, the bottom line is that we need more global peace and competition. And attacking smaller countries is not a solution at the end of the day. But I think I leave it to the government to decide what to say or do. The current challenge now is how do we help our nationals to come to safe places and so on.
Let me ask you about the role that the media, traditional, online, and so on, have played in this situation. Because anytime you have a conflict of this nature, so many people, including decision makers, rely on the media for information, and because the information now is instant, is real time, and so on, they're even more reliant on getting the correct thing. Insofar as you know it, both at the international, particularly at the international level, has the media reported this fairly? Has the media been fair in bringing up both sides of the argument? Or has it been a question of everybody to your tents and each media organization or group is reporting from the perspective of his organization, of his country?
Mm. Well, you know, you're a media man. They're doing their best to report things the way they see things. Let me put it that way. You know how it works. At times, certain media houses, platforms are owned by certain people who want to present a certain view. I know that the Russian media will definitely be presenting this matter the way Putin wants it to be presented, especially for local consumption. So, and Western media, again, are presenting it the way they see it or the way they want to see it. All the same, we wouldn't say that the media is leading us. Most of the time, they say what it is, especially in this case now, I can see that the principal media station are bringing out the horrors of what is happening in Ukraine, the challenge to the human issues, the human angles, the movement of people suffering, dead, all that, collapsed houses. Um, I think the media is doing okay. They're doing what media houses, media uh, do, not always. And good enough, again, the media is supported by the social media, which wasn't there early times. So that even if the media, CNN or channels is presenting a certain view, there are aspects that the social media comes up and individual angles, individual opinion, organizational angles, opinion, these are all coming together. It helps to influence what action government takes. So I would say that the media is all right doing what media do. We wouldn't blame this problem on the media core. We wouldn't say that the media misled anyone.
It's on that note that we'll have to leave it. Your Excellency, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure having you on the program.
Thank you for having me.
That's our program today. We would, of course, like to hear from you on the conversation. Our social media handles are right there on your screen. You can also listen to this and previous episodes of the program via our podcast. Please visit our website, channelstv.com, to get started. I am Ladi Akiriduluale. Goodbye.